Chapter 6, Section 2, Part 2. When we last left off, a riot had taken place when customs officers in Boston tried to seize the American merchant ship to Liberty, which was carrying smuggled wine, when a riot broke out. The rioters had forced the customs officers to flee. Fearing a loss of control, British officials had called for more troops into Boston. Samuel Adams had replied, "We will destroy every soldier that dares put foot on shore. I look upon them as foreign enemies." So as we begin, we are going to begin to study the causes of the Boston Massacre. Please make sure to have your Google Doc open and completing the Google Notes through the Google Doc and submit through the Google Classroom as you watch the video. So the Boston Massacre. In the fall of 1768, 1,000 British soldiers, known as Redcoats for their bright red jackets, arrived in Boston under the command of General Thomas Gage. With their arrival, tensions filled the streets of Boston. Since the soldiers were poorly paid, they hired themselves out as workers, usually at rates much lower than those of American workers. Resentment against the Redcoats grew because business owners were hiring the Redcoats at a cheaper rate instead of the Americans. Soldiers and street youths often yelled insults at each other. "Lobsters, lobsters for sale," the youths would yell, referring to the soldiers' Redcoats. "Yankees," the soldiers would jeer. A Yankee was supposed to be an insult, but the colonists soon took pride in the name. On March 5th, 1770, tensions finally exploded into violence. A group of youths and dock workers, among them Crispus Attucks, started trading insults in front of the custom house. A fight broke out, and the soldiers began firing. Attucks and 4 workers were killed. The Sons of Liberty called the shooting the Boston Massacre. They said that Attucks and the 4 others had given their lives for freedom. The incident became a tool for anti-British propaganda in newspaper articles, pamphlets, and posters. The people of Boston were outraged. Meanwhile, the Redcoats who had fired the shots were arrested for murder. John Adams, seen here, a lawyer and cousin of Samuel Adams, defended them in court. Adams was criticized for taking the case. He replied that the law should be, quote, "deaf to the clamors of the populace." In other words, regardless of what popular opinion is, the law should follow the law. Facts are facts, regardless of what you want them to be. He supported the colonial cause, but wanted to show that the colonists followed the rule of law. Adams argued that the soldiers had acted in self-defense. The jury agreed. Too many colonists, however, the Boston Massacre would stand as a symbol of British tyranny or evil rule. The Tea Act. The colonists were unaware that on the day of the Boston Massacre, Parliament proposed the repeal of the Townshend Acts. 1 month later, all the acts except the tax on tea were repealed. The colonial boycott had been effective. British trade had been hurt, but Parliament kept the tea tax to show that it still had the right to tax the colonists. For most Americans, the crisis was over. Samuel Adams, however, wanted to make sure people did not forget the cause of liberty. He started a drive to form committees of correspondence in various towns in Massachusetts. These groups exchanged letters on colonial affairs. Before long, committees throughout Massachusetts were corresponding with one another and with committees in other colonies. Then, in 1773, Parliament opened up old wounds when it passed the Tea Act. Tea was very popular in the colonies, but much of it was smuggled in from Holland. The Tea Act gave the British East India Company control over the American tea trade. The tea would arrive in the colonies only in the trading company's ships and be sold there by its merchants. Colonists who had not been paying any tax on smuggled tea would now have to pay a tax on this regulated tea. This enraged the colonial shippers and merchants. The colonists wondered what Parliament would do next. The funny part about this was the taxed tea was actually cheaper than the smuggled tea, but it was the point that they were paying taxes to a government in which they did not have representation that greatly angered the colonists. The Boston Tea Party. Protests against the Tea Act took place all over the colonies. In Charleston, South Carolina, colonists unloaded tea and let it rot on the docks. In New York City and Philadelphia, colonists blocked tea ships from landing. In Boston, the Sons of Liberty organized what came to be known as the Boston Tea Party. On the evening of December 16, 1773, a group of men disguised as Native Americans boarded 3 tea ships docked in Boston Harbor. One of the men, George Hughes, a Boston shoemaker, later recalled the events. A voice from the past. We then were ordered by our commander to open the hatches and take out all of the chests of tea and throw them overboard. In about 3 hours from the time we went on board, we had thus broken and thrown overboard every tea chest to be found on the ship, while those in other ships were disposing of the tea in the same way at the same time. George Hughes, quoted in A Retrospect of the Boston Tea Party. So we do our soaps analysis here. The speaker, George Hughes. The occasion would have been on the night of the Boston Tea Party in 1773, obviously in Boston. The audience, if it's a retrospect of the Boston Tea Party, then it could have been intended intentionally for, we would say, posterity, those in the future, or he could have been keeping a journal for himself. The purpose is to persuade, inform, or entertain, would be to inform, and the subject, the main idea, was the actions that took place on the night of the Boston Tea Party of George Hughes receiving orders from his commander to smash open the tea chest and throw the tea overboard. That night, Hughes and the others destroyed 342 chests of tea. Many colonists rejoiced at the news. They believed that Britain would now see how strongly colonists opposed taxation without representation. Others doubted that destroying property was the best way to settle the tax debate. Some colonial leaders offered to pay for the tea if Parliament would repeal the Tea Act. Britain rejected the offer. It not only wanted repayment, but it also wanted the men who destroyed the tea to be brought to trial. The British reaction to the Boston Tea Party would fan the flames of rebellion in the 13 colonies, as we will see in the next section. This is now the end of Section 2. There are a few questions you should be able to answer. First, why did colonists oppose the Townshend Acts? Second, why were British troops sent to Boston? Third, what prompted the Boston Tea Party? Finally, do you think colonial outrage over the Boston Massacre was justified? Explain thinking about how the British troops were taunted, or, our end, whether troops have the right to fire on citizens. Finally, make sure you have completed your Google Doc and submitted through the Google Classroom. When you've done so, we'll see you in class tomorrow.